They once fought to defend South Korea. 70 years later, these foreign veterans are choosing to be buried there. CNN. For more than 30 years, British veteran James Grundy made an annual 5,500-mile journey to South Korea to visit the graves of bodies he had recovered as the young man thrust into war. Grundy was just 19 when he joined the Korean War in 1951, according to the United Nations Memorial Cemetery in Korea. As part of as part of the recovery unit, he recovered the fallen soldiers from battlefield across the Korean peninsula and transported them for burial at the cemetery located in the southern coastal city of Busan. The cemetery remains the only UN cemetery in the world, and for many, a final site of reunion between veterans, widows, and loved ones lost in the Korean War. It was formally established in 1959 after the South Korea government offered the land for the UN permanent use to honor the troops and medical personnel sent from 22 countries under the UN flag during the war. Though most of those countries repatriated the bodies of their fallen, more than 2,300 people from 11 nations are currently interred there, according to UNMCK. Many of those soldiers were later joined by loved ones who wishes to be buried together, including their widows and other family members. Today, the cemetery is the idyllic, idyllic 35-acre stretch of green grass and water features with a memorabilia hall monument dedicated by various countries that participated in the war, and remembrance were engraved with all the names of UN troops who died during the conflict. Whenever Grundy buried the body he recovered, he promised, "I will come back to you, won't forget you," said his adoptive granddaughter, Brenda Eun Park. That's why he came back to Korea every year to keep his promise. Starting in 1988, he made annual trips to the cemetery until the pandemic hurt travel. In May, though Grundy was battling cancer and growing weaker, he insisted to come to Korea for a final visit, Park said. It was the only pleasure in his life, she added. He wanted to come back once more. Grundy died in August in the UK. His ashes will be flown to the UN cemetery, where he will be interred, as instructed in his will. He wanted to rest in peace in the cemetery with his comrades, Park said. Quick history. The Korean War, sometimes referred to as a forgotten war, despite the millions of lives lost, broke out in June 1950 after North Korean troops invaded South Korea. The United States called it an emergency meeting of the UN Security Council, which that decided just 2 days after the invasion to send the troops to Korea. The only time in the organization's history that combat troops has been dispatched in the name of the UN. The 22 nation United Nations Command helped turn the momentum of the war with the US lead forces advancing toward China's border with North Korea. But Chinese troops intervened, pushing the UN back down the peninsula. Both sides reaches the stalemate along the 38th parallel, where the border between the two Koreas sits together. An armistice signed on July 27th, 1953, stopped the conflict. However, the war never officially ended because there was no peace treaty, and its impact lingers to this day. The American cover watches as the 9-year-old Korean girl places the bouquet of white roses on the grave of the one of his fallen comrades and at the UN Memorial near Busan, South Korea, 1951. For some veterans, the UN cemetery represents both the cost of the war and the deep ties they forged with other soldiers and with South Korea itself. Boyd L. Watt, an American veteran who joins the war at 18 years old, told the Korean publication Hobbs magazine he had been visiting Busan at least once a year since 1991. It amazed him how much the country had developed in just a few decades, he said. A theme was also underscored at the cemetery. At the memorial service hall, a video for visitors highlights South Korea's transformation from the war-torn nation into a flourishing modern metropolis made possible by the sacrifice of UN troops itself. He said, South Korea honor guards carry flags of the UN allied nations during the memorial cemetery ceremony for UN veterans of the Korean War at the UN Memorial Cemetery in Busan on November 11th, 2020. Other veterans who made a return visit to Busan have echoed the sentiment. Johann Theodor Oldewelwad, who served as the private first class and fought hand to hand against North Korean soldiers, returned to South Korea in 2016, his first time back since he was discharged during the war. According to a report by South Korean news agency Yonhap, Oldewaled Warlord said he was profoundly moved by the country's economic revival. He died the following year and was interred at the cemetery, following his will, which stated he wanted his ashes buried in the Republic of Korea, where my comrades lie in eternal sleep. According to Yun Hop, final resting place as the small group of surviving veterans age a growing number, hailing from places around the world, have asked to be buried at the cemetery beside the friends and fellow comrades in the foreign country he had once fought to defend. What the American veteran told Hobbs magazine in 2010, they got a lot of us old forges buried out there. I'd like to be a part of it. His wish was granted after his death in 2020 with family, friends, and representatives of the US military and embassy attending the ceremony. Another US veteran, Russell Harold Johnstown, served in the military police during the war and was buried at the UN cemetery in 2020. Mr. Johnstad was at first opposed to the idea of his being buried at the UNMCK, saying he felt he was not as deserving as others who lie there. But his wife and family are able to persuade him to change his mind, said the UNMCK in the statement on its website. The most recent overseas veteran to be buried at the cemetery is John Robert Cormier from Canada, who died in 2021 and was interred in June this year. He was just 1919 when he arrived in Korea for the war, returning to the battlefield even after suffering a life threatening injury, according to the UNFCK. It had been his adamant wish to be interred at the cemetery, said the UNFCK after his ceremony, adding he wouldn't have missed his 380 Canadian comrades who wait for him here, and today they are once again together. Today, the cemetery, located not far from the coast, remains the popular destination for war history travelers. Accessible by bus and subway, free to enter, it also hosts the UN flag raising and lowering ceremony every day, with special events to commemorate key dates like the outbreak of the Korean War.